Okay, calm down.
What kind of politics were you raised in? Were your parents political? And have you always had this political realist perspective that you are so well known for?
Well, my parents were not political at all. I was born in New York City and grew up in New York City and then the suburbs of New York. And my parents were not political. My father was basically a Republican, and my mother came from a very Democratic family. Both basically New York ethnics. And they ever hardly ever talked about politics. And it wasn't until I went to West Point and towards the end of my time there where I got interested in international politics, not domestic politics, international politics, that I became fascinated with the subject. Of course, it was hard to avoid politics when I was in my late teens and when I was at West Point, in large part because of the Vietnam War. And I remember very well, the events of 1968. So I began to get a taste for politics in a serious way then, but not any real intellectual interest until I started studying international relations. And then I got into a PhD program at Cornell and eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And I think what happened over time, in large part because I am intellectually very curious, is that I started asking all sorts of questions about politics in general, going beyond international politics. And at some point, I came to the realization that everything is connected. And if you want to know a lot about how the international system works, you have to know a lot about domestic politics and vice versa. So, with the passage of time, I learned a great deal about politics in general. And at the same time, I started off basically as a straightforward academic, and the idea of commenting on the real world and acting as something of, let's call it a public intellectual, really didn't cross my mind. But I always felt that my academic work had relevance for what was going on in the real world. So what happened is that over time, I got increasingly involved in the public debates that were taking place inside the country and really inside places like Europe and Asia as well. And with the passage of time, I've gotten more and more involved. And as you well know, that's certainly true with the outbreak of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. But in a nutshell, that's sort of how it all happened.
Have you had kind of political ideology influence you at all? Because I know that you are, again, of the school of political realism. Curious about how that can intersect with political ideology.
It's funny, when I first went to graduate school, this is in 1975, there were sort of three dominant paradigms for looking at the world in the field of international relations. One was liberalism, two was realism, and three was Marxism. It's hard to believe now, but Marxism was a very important paradigm for thinking about international politics. Whether you accepted that paradigm or not, you knew a lot about it. And I actually read a lot of Marx back in the day. I took a course on Marxist theories of the state. And of course, this has all gone away now. But those were the sort of big paradigms of the day. But when I went to graduate school, and even when I was a postdoc at Harvard for the first 2 years after I got my PhD, I did not really view myself as a realist.
Mm.
I didn't think about realism versus liberalism versus Marxism. I knew the literatures, but I didn't pay much attention to sort of categorizing myself. But after I got to the University of Chicago and I started teaching a basic IR theory course, I came to the realization that I was effectively a realist. Now, why did I decide that I was a realist? A lot of people say, oh, it's because you went to West Point and therefore how could you be anything but a realist? I really don't think that's true. And I could point to a number of people who went to West Point who got PhDs who fit in the liberal category, not the realist category. I think that I became a realist because I concluded, and one doesn't have to agree with this, but I concluded that it was the best of those three paradigms for explaining how the world works. I think realism is far from a perfect set of theories, but it is the best among those three sets of theories. And for that reason, I sort of settled on self identifying as a realist.
Where does a country like Cuba fit into this? Because maybe it's naive of me, and certainly one can disagree with or disapprove of Cuba, but it does seem like, in terms of, they do have some kind of ethical or moral vision that's not just about political survival.
Well, almost all countries have some ideology. Some have a very powerful ideology. There's no question that for many years, Cuba was a communist country, especially in Fidel's early days. The Soviet Union at one point was a heavily communist oriented country. Nazi Germany was a fascist country. The United States is a liberal democracy. Uh, with regard to Cuba, let me say a few words. First of all, Cuba matters a lot to the United States from a realist point of view because it's physically located in the Western Hemisphere and it's America's backyard. And the United States is going to care more about the Western Hemisphere than any other region of the world, simply because it's our backyard. And Cuba is right next door to us. And that means we're going to pay a lot of attention to Cuba. But our attitude towards Cuba during the Cold War, when the real trouble started, was not simply based on geopolitics. It was also based on the fact that Cuba was a communist country. And as you well know, during the Cold War, and this was true even before and after the Cold War, any country in Latin America that has leftist leanings is likely to end up in America's gun sights, and we're likely to try to topple that regime. It doesn't even have to be a communist regime. All it
Right.
has to do is be left leaning, and we'll do
Like the
terrible things.
Dominican Republic or Guatemala.
Yeah, Guatemala is a very good example, 1954, and Nicaragua. We could go on and on. Chile,
Right.
1973. These are just all examples. And if we go back earlier in the century, you'll see evidence of that sort of anti left wing tendencies in American foreign policy when it comes to dealing with Latin America. From a realist point of view, I think this doesn't make much sense, right? Because in a realist story, ideology doesn't matter that much. Uh, in my view, you can live with a communist country. We could have lived with Cuba. Uh, the problem with Cuba was that once it became an enemy of the United States, Cuba went to the Soviet Union for help. And once Cuba went to the Soviet Union for help, then it became an important geopolitical issue. And of course, the first manifestation of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then later, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I remember very well, the Soviets were talking about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. And the Americans told them in no uncertain terms that that is not happening. And that's geopolitical logic at play. But again, I don't want to argue that there was no ideological dimension to this because there was a powerful ideological dimension. And actually, I think if you look at our relationship with Cuba today, it's really quite remarkable that we can't get over the fact that we had this crisis with Cuba during the Cold War. I mean, Cuba is not a communist country in any meaningful sense. It's not a threat to the United States in an ideological way. A lot of people argued during the Cold War that ideology really mattered and communism anywhere was a real
Right.
problem. I didn't believe that, but I could see where people made that argument. But how can you make that argument today? But we cannot get over the fact that Cuba crossed us during the Cold War. The fact that Fidel formed a close relationship with the Soviets, which led to them placing missiles in Cuba, is something that we've never gotten over. To my amazement, we still have gun sights on Cuba, even when we have a Democratic president like
Right.
Joe Biden.
I mean, you obviously wrote this amazing book on the Israel lobby, but there is a Cuba lobby.
Florida used to be a real swing state.
Right.
Remember the 2000 election? And in a swing state where there are a significant number of Cuban Americans, you want to make sure that you don't alienate those Cuban Americans. Uh, and those Cuban Americans, by and large, in Florida, are profoundly anti-Castro slash anti-Cuba. So it is, or it has been very difficult for us to have good relations with Cuba because of the Cuba lobby.
Right.
So there's no question that you're on the money when you raise the issue of the Cuba lobby.
There's also an interesting parallel I've found between the Israel lobby and the Cuba lobby, in that you have, for obvious reasons, older people who are much more um, maybe emotionally driven about the issue and extreme and very, very vocal. And then you have, especially the younger generation, which really doesn't have that kind of attachment to it. And you're seeing a real demographic shift.
Yeah, I had a student, he was an undergrad here at Chicago, probably about 10 years ago, who wrote a BA thesis under my
Oh, nice.
supervision on the Cuba lobby. And he made exactly that point, and he had a lot of data to support it. But as I recollect, his argument was that the elders tend to select the more hawkish
Right.
individuals among the youth to replace them. So there is this continuity in terms of a hawkish attitude towards Cuba.